really happy to be able to do this. So.
Talk after.
Yeah.
Thank you again. Of course. So much. I don't think they're here to see me. I don't think they're here to see me.
One of my friends came too. I can't believe we have hot mics. It's so dangerous.
Thanks for meeting the girls.
Oh my god, they're so sweet. How old are they?
Margo's 18. She's at UVA. And Lila's 17. She's a junior.
Wow, you did it back to back.
Yeah. So that's a funny story. That wasn't intentional.
It's not normally
They're
intentional.
only 14 months apart.
Yeah. Oh my god, like Stephanie.
It was like having one big baby for a while.
So fucking crazy.
But they walked so early. They both walked at 9 months.
Yeah, so I was like,
It's not to be desired.
yeah, but no one do.
I didn't know at the time. I was like, fucking gifted. And I was like, this is a fucking thing.
Oh my
So
god.
they tried to kill each other.
I have a couple friends who've all like suffered the same thing where they like didn't even get a period and they were fucking pregnant. Yeah. I'm really glad that didn't happen to me because I think I would have liked it at the time and like I wouldn't be able to have the life I do now, you know. So
Yeah, it was, I mean, literally, we know the party.
yeah,
She just lost all her weight.
yeah.
And like, people were like, when did you find out you got pregnant again? And I was like, when I came home, and she started fucking throwing shit at me. She was like, what the fuck is wrong with you?
That's hilarious.
But they're such great.
Yeah, it must. I mean, it's so nice they get to be best friends, right? Like,
Yes, they're so different.
yeah,
Lila's the younger one's the athlete.
yeah.
She's like that. She's done jujitsu for 7 years.
Oh wow. Okay.
She was the one who got me into jujitsu.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm an only child, so I have no. Oh, that's us. I thought you go out first.
Go ahead, there you go. Come on.
Oops. Well, there we go. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Adam, I think we wanted to start with a reading of the prologue, right?
Yes.
All right, let's do it.
Yes. I'm just going to read the prologue. Take like 4 minutes. Playworld. Can you all hear me, by the way? Okay.
I'm going to turn the mic up.
Thanks. Better? There we go. Okay. In the fall of 1980, when I was 14, a friend of my parents named Naomi Shaw fell in love with me. She was 36, mother of 2, and married to a wealthy man. Like so many things that happened to me that year, it didn't seem strange at the time. 2 decades later, when I finally told my mother we were on Long Island taking a walk on the beach, she stopped, stunned, and said, "But she was such an ugly woman." The remark wasn't as petty as it sounds. If I was aware of it then, it neither repulsed me nor affected my feelings for Naomi. It was just a thing I took for granted, like the color of her hair. Wiry and ashen, it had the shading, but not the shimmer of pigeon feathers. Naomi kept it long, so that it fell past her shoulders. I knew it by touch, for my face was often buried in it. Only later did I wonder if she considered herself unattractive, because she always wore sunglasses, as if to hide her face, large gold frames with blue-tinted prescription lenses. When we were driving together, which was often that year, she'd allow these to slide down her nose and then look at me over their bridge. She might have considered this pose winning, but it was more likely to see me better. Her mouth often hung slightly open. Her lower teeth were uneven, and her tongue, which pressed against them, always tasted of coffee. Naomi's car was a silver Mercedes sedan, 300 SD, along with turbo diesel nickel-plated on the back, that made a deep hum when she drove. The interior, enormous in my mind's eye, was tricked out with glossy wood paneling and white leather, back seats so wide and legroom so ample, they made the driver appear to be far away. It was in this car that Naomi and I talked most often. We'd park, and then she'd lean across the armrest to press her cheek to mine, and I'd sometimes allow her to kiss me. Other times, we'd move to the back. Lying there with Naomi, her nose nuzzled to my neck, I'd stare at the ceiling's dotted fabric until the patterns seemed to detach and drift like a starred sky. This car was her prized possession, and like many commuters, she had turned the machine into an extension of her body. Her left thumb lightly hooked the wheel at 8 o'clock when traffic was moving, her fingertips sliding to 11 when it was slow. She preferred to sit slightly reclined, her free hands spread on her inner thigh, though after she lost her pinky that summer, and even after being fitted with a prosthesis, she kept it tucked away. I worried you'd think it was disgusting, she said, the digit hidden between the seat and her hip. She'd bought herself a diamond ring to hide the seam, and for the most part, the likeness was uncanny, but at certain angles you could tell. The cuticle's line was too smooth, the nails pale crescent, too creamy to match the others. Like my father's fake teeth, which he occasionally left lying around our apartment, I was fascinated by it, though my curiosity wasn't morbid. I was a child actor, you see, a student of all forms of dissembling, and had long ago found my greatest subject to be adults. Thanks.
Such a beautiful prologue and so much of the book. I'm so excited for everyone here who hasn't gotten to read the beautiful, beautiful prose. It's absolutely incredible.
Thank you.
Okay, let's kick it off. I want to get right into it. I thought we would start with sort of the most obvious thing, the title. I feel like Playworld sort of reminds me of Never Never Land, and I think it alludes to both Griffin's ability to sort of his relationship to reality and sort of this like way of play acting in the world, but then also the larger than life portrayal of Manhattan as sort of this Never Never Land, or
Yes.
this Disneyland. So I wanted to ask, how did you come to the title, and are there other aspects of playing in the novel that speak to that?
Yeah, so I love that the question begins with profundity, because the irony is that Playworld, the title, comes from a commercial jingle, and I don't see any Gen Xers in here, except maybe way in the back my agent. But there was a local toy store commercial, and the toy store was called Playworld, and it was like in Hempstead and Hackensack, and I didn't plan on singing, but it goes Playworld, a world of toys, great for girls and great for boys. Playworld, where prices go so low, 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 low. And so anyway, the reason thank you. If the novel doesn't work out, I'll clearly not go into singing. But so, like a lot of kids, I watched way too much television back in the day. And but my father was also a commercial voiceover actor. My father did not sing jingles. But we knew lots of people, because both my parents were in the arts, who sang jingles. So there was this way in which, on the one hand, you were like, oh my God, Playworld, toys, Dad, please take us to get toys. And then there was, the fact that there was this professional component, which in a way answers your question, because a big part of Playworld, Griffin is raised by an actor and a dancer. His father has at least been his father has been adjacent to greatness. I mean, his father has worked with people like Josh Logan and Leonard Bernstein. There is a character in the novel modeled after Alan J. Lerner, who my father also worked with, named Abe Fountain. And so there's that idea of play and theatrics, and the way in which For those of you who either are actors or no actors, I mean, actors put on personas, and we can get into the child actor thing. But the other thing is that as a Gen Xer, someone who grew up in Manhattan, I grew up with, in the era of what people sort of like to call, with some degree of, critical posture, benign neglect. But, my brother and I and all of my friends, we roamed the city like feral kids. I mean, my favorite story to tell about this, I went to PS 59 until 6th grade, and but we lived on the Upper West Side, and my mom, we were taking the bus alone in 1st grade. We were riding our bikes across town, helmetless, in 3rd. My mom would give us a dime and be like, "Call me when you get to school to let me know you made it." Which is like an inconceivable way of thinking about parenting. But invariably what happened was, and this gets to the fantasy part, we had random monster encounters all the time. Mm-hmm. By which I mean, like we my brother and I, in these odysseys to get to school, whether it was taking the bus and the bus would break down in a stop in a place that we weren't familiar with, whether it was like witnessing fights between construction workers. I cannot even count the number of times I got mugged, and that my brother and I had to deal with that kind of stuff. So, I mean, there was a way in which, it was very much like cortisol city, I mean, like and yet we had total freedom. Your only responsibility at that time was to show up at 6 p.m. I mean, you were in deep shit if you didn't show up at 6 a.m. for dinner. But just to show up at 6 p.m. and then you would like talk about your day. And the thing is, as somebody who's raised 2 daughters, we rarely eat dinner together because they're so busy. They're so overscheduled. But in that era, we ate dinner together all the time. And then to sort of finish with the idea of masking, I mean, like we didn't, just because we gathered and ate dinner didn't mean we necessarily told anybody about what was going on. Mm-hmm. So there are all those levels. And the thing is that like in an era where people are so obsessed about children, anxiety disorders, phones, the lack of a play-based childhood, well, I will say without getting on my soapbox that I think we were blessed by that level of freedom, and I think the resilience of Griffin in the book is really not that different from the resilience of most of my cohort. I mean, we dealt with a lot of shit on our own. Mm-hmm. Is what I'm saying.
There's so much there that we're going to circle back to. No. I mean, I had a lot in the first question, and you answered all of it beautifully. But let's talk a little bit more about Manhattan. Yeah. I think there's this Holden-esque quality to the book. And like in Catcher in the Rye and in Playworld, Manhattan can be sort of seen as this full of opportunity, play world, as we were discussing, but also has a lot of alienation. Yes. And we talked a little bit about, how that served for the kids at that time and for Griffin. But I'm curious, like, if you could talk a little bit about, the city itself, how it serves as a character, which ways, it reflects and amplifies the turbulence and the growth of Griffin, but also, how it impacts the adults as well, which I think you do a really beautiful job of capturing, protecting and deceiving Griffin and protecting and deceiving these adults as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a fantastic question. I mean, so, so much of what I was trying to do in Playworld was to kind of capture, like, this sounds kind of arty-farty, but capture like certain shades of light, certain ways in which the city presented, certain ways in which you negotiated the city, the vehicles of the city, the way in which you moved around it, and in a certain way, because the city had its various, like, at the time when New York when New York, in some ways, Manhattan, I mean, was like a far less expansive place in a weird way. By which I mean you were very much a creature of neighborhoods. You know what I mean? I don't think I came to Brooklyn until I was like in 7th grade. And my friend lived in Brooklyn Heights. Like Brooklyn was truly in this weird kind of magical way, this like land beyond. And so in some ways the idea was to put New York on the sort of fulcrum of place that is magically unstable, where anything can happen, and place that is very hard and gritty, which it was, which Manhattan was at that time. So to give you an example, it's not a spoiler, but there's a scene, I mean, I guess people don't do this anymore, but there's a scene where after a really long night out, the kids go and they decide they're fucking bored and they're like, let's do crank calls. Let's crank call people. And Orrin, Griffin's brother, and his friend have a subway map where they've written payphone numbers and their locations. And we had similar things like this when, because this is what we did on a Saturday night when you were growing up at my age. And so they crank call these people. And Orrin does this like Academy Award winning job of.
Spooky, honestly, it's hard for me to read.
Academy Award winning job of playing a very famous person. And then they crank call someone else who is nearby Central Park. And he says, meet me in Sheep Meadow and I'll tell you the meaning of life. And they're like, fuck it, let's go. And they go to Sheep Meadow. And but here's the thing. Sheep Meadow back then, crossing Central Park at night in 1980 was a no-go thing. You just didn't do that. And so for them to go, going back to your first question, again, speaks to that idea of both like Neverland kind of play, magical kind of play. And then they do encounter somebody who tells them this tale that is insane, which again, I don't think that's changed about New York. But like, you sit next to somebody on the subway and just like sometimes you have these conversations on planes and somebody will tell you if they can break their New York reserve, somebody will tell you the most insane shit you've ever heard in your life. And that's what's interesting about Manhattan still. I mean New York City still, which is the crazy, in that crazy nearness, that propinquitousness that we experience where we're jammed up against people and we're silent. And yet sometimes a kind of intimacy is forced upon us. I'm getting really digressive here, but like people always talk about New Yorkers as mean. I don't think New Yorkers are mean. I think they're really efficient. So it's like if you're freaking slow on the subway, I hate you. But if something happens, this is not the New York of Kitty Genovese. Nobody's going to watch somebody get raped and do nothing. I mean, like we rode our bikes all around Manhattan. We'd get in accidents and the hot dog guy would be like, here's some napkins, put that on your face. A cab driver would take us to Lenox Hill Hospital. I mean, like, so that's another aspect of it.
And just because I'm actually curious, I really do I think what's so interesting about this coming of age story is that you do investigate, you're very generous with the adult characters.
Yes.
And we often are sort of saturated into their POV and we switch POV for no spoilers there, just something exciting to get for. So I did want to kind of talk about, you just spoke to the kids, but
yeah.
I would like to kind of touch on what the adults, their
okay.
Playworld,
again,
their Neverland.
So of course, so my editors and I had a theme that we talked about all the time, which was the city that no longer exists. And one of the ways in which New York, for the adults, is a city that no longer exists is this. And I'm going to say this, and I know that people in the audience will get this, and here goes. My father, as a sometimes working actor, and my mother as a ballet instructor, and then a person who had a private Pilates business, raised 2 kids in Manhattan, put them through private school, owned a house in the Hamptons. And now again, and I'm not saying we were not. When I was at Trinity School in New York, I was one of the poorest people I knew. but I just didn't know I was poor comparatively. But my point is that, there was a way in which New York then had this still aspirational quality but that also felt, certainly for Shell, that's the father character, had this intense level of precarity where, because they were, to my mind, the last of the creative class who could live in Manhattan, okay, they're on the knife edge. And so in that way, again, like something out of The Princess Bride, where they run into the forest where they run into rats of enormous size or whatever it is. It's like at any time financially it could be and their lives could be changed. So I mean, in the novel, and again, it's not a spoiler either, for a brief period of time they do the Jeffersons thing and they move on up to the Upper West Side, and then they get knocked back down to what is essentially a borderland, an economic borderland. And so that precarity, as you know, without spoiling anything, informs how they parent, right? And informs the choices they make with Griffin, because Griffin's role as a child actor, well, I mean, I think it's in enough of the reviews, it's not a spoiler, but Griffin's role as a child actor, he's helping to support the family. And he's not being, these aren't Svengali parents. They're not like, you better support the family. He feels great love for them, and so his ambivalence about what he does is, I think, one of the things that makes it very moving.
Yeah, I think also it's a reflection of sort of the general sentiment of what's so interesting about Griffin's story is that he's sort of like a child in an adult's world. So him, paying for or covering his tuition it falls into that gray area.
Correct.
That sort of.
He is in the lingua franca of today's parenting how-to books. He is over-parentified. Yeah.
Well, this is perfect. Leads me to my next question, which is more about the adults, and specifically, you said Naomi, or you said Naomi? Naomi. Okay. So I'm just curious, this is a woman that Griffin ends up being in a relationship with. Again, no spoilers, we just got to read the prologue. And I just sort of was interested in, I think all these adults obviously reflect the time period, 1980s Manhattan. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, is she a product of her time, reflecting this archetypal abandoned wife of the American nuclear family and the excesses and disillusionment of 1980s Manhattan? Or is there, or just as a writer, is this a larger is she a larger symbol? And how much does the sort of specifics of the things that are conditioning her really are central to the book, or would you say that she's sort of larger than that?
I'm going to answer the question. I am kind of dying to hear what you think, given what you've written about. But to me, there's an enormous component of her that predicts some of the post-feminist / marriage as a broken form of technology that, you know what I mean, that you see being so ubiquitous in the cultural roles and the cultural commentary, right? But what I will also say, not just in terms of Griffin as a child actor who is a child constantly among adults, but what I do like to say vis-a-vis Naomi is the way I think about Naomi more, which is less gendered in a way, is I thought of her almost more thematically. Look, she's straight up characterologically. She's extremely lonely. She's in a terrible marriage. She, in some ways, I mean, she is straight ahead predatory. Griffin, in strange ways, gives her permission to be younger in ways that she gives him permission to be older. So that to me is a dynamic that continues to this day, and hopefully it continues to this day on the continuum of more healthy. I mean, obviously, I've had some of the most impactful mentors in my life who were like that. But, you know, in that era, the boundaries were much more porous if they existed at all. And I guess for me, I thought about a lot about Naomi, actually politically, and I'll say what I mean by that. You know, the novel said in 1980 and 1981, end of the Carter administration, beginning of the Reagan administration, and this was the era. You know, in 1981, Ronald Reagan signs one of the most gigantic tax breaks in the history of the country, the Kemp-Roth Tax Relief Act, right? Lowers rates by 35%. The debt at the start of the Reagan era was, I think, $900 billion, and by the end of the Reagan era, it was $2 trillion. Okay. So when we talk about the debt bomb in this country, that's where it started. That's ground zero. I don't say that politically. What I'm saying is there was a get mine now ethos in the 1980s, a get mine now ethos, that in the novel, the adults stand in for the political sphere, okay? Because what was Ronald Reagan was deregulation, small government, and we were the generation of deregulated parenting. We were the generation of small parenting. And what's interesting, because you as a parent sort of stand a little bit behind me, but so many people in my generation overcorrected, right? And got too involved with their parents. I mean, too involved with their kids, right? And my kids are sitting in the front row, and I neglect them all the time. And they're doing great. But anyway, my point is that she embodies that. She embodies that get mine now ethos, which of course has particular expressions in who she is.
I mean, the other character, who is actually the other adult who seems the most interested in Griffin's reality and invested in his desires and his world is, of course, his wrestling coach,
Yes.
who is also the other predatory, one could argue, character.
Yes.
And it's sad. It's really sad to see that sort of the two most interested adults in Griffin's life are the ones that are taking advantage of him, or at least getting something out of the relationship for their own, even though they are the adults. And I wanted to speak a little bit to Kellington. What do you think these two characters symbolize in relation to Griffin's evolving understanding of intimacy, power, and ultimately, hopefully, journey to will and self-empowerment? And the reason I'm asking this right after is because I think there could be a way you tie this back into the political. Not prompting anything, but...
No, well, you know, so maybe this is kind of sort of a Gen X predisposition, but I'm going to say something, I don't think it'd be controversial, but I'll give it a shot. Like, you can still learn a lot from damaged people, right? You can learn a lot from damaged people. And Griffin becomes who he is, or is, let's just say, aimed toward, by the novel's end, is aimed toward who he is, in part because of Naomi's audience, because of her care. Does it bleed into predation? Yes. Griffin becomes one of the most important things Griffin's wrestling coach says to him. And Griffin's wrestling coach is an outright predator, right? But one of Griffin's constant coaching mantras to Griffin is, you've got to move. You've got to move on the mat. And movement, I'm a big believer that you're really living life if movement is your resting state. Movement has got to be your resting state. You know what I mean? And that is something that Griffin carries with him, will carry with him for the entirety of his life. You're not a full-blooded living and breathing artist if movement isn't your resting state. If you're not growing, and growing is uncomfortable. And so Keppelman gives him that, but to put a finer point on your question, because I think this is what you're asking, it's a miseducation in love. Because Griffin, in this way that all young people want to please those that are conveying to them essential knowledge, Griffin is passionate about wrestling. I was passionate about wrestling. Griffin has this terrible lesson, which is that he learns to love people through darker forms of other people's love. I mean, I think that that's something that happens to all of us. I don't think we escape that. We take our family of origin sense of love, or those who instruct us, and we reenact that, right? There's your motif of acting. We reenact it. Mm-hmm. You know, C.G. Jung has this great quote, which is, first love is a repetition of the Oedipal complex. So first love is a repeat of that first dynamic. It's a reenactment. And so Griffin, who is obviously in the novel toggling between Griffin future, this future self who's narrating, and also the Griffin who is experiencing things in the moment, he needs to learn how to shake off that idea that to get to love or to get to Eros, you have to go through someone else's idea of love.
But
does
that
make sense?
True when it's when it's not an adult and a child interacting? I mean, I'm curious because I think when Amanda comes into play, like he's, without whatever, we do finally get to see our character sort of draw a boundary, right?
Yeah.
In one way or another. But it's with somebody his own age, not with an adult.
Correct.
After watching him in the adult world, and I did want to ask you about that decision.
Which decision?
Just that there's no boundary really set with any of the adults that he's been interacting or the miseducation.
Yeah, I mean,
so he's applying this miseducation to somebody his own age, but that's a totally different dynamic, obviously, because there's a different power dynamic.
True. I mean, I would say that without spoiling anything, like the Griffin-Amanda relationship, in some ways, is his first opportunity to either go through repetition or become a new self, whether or not that works out. I mean, one of my favorite expressions, our mutual friend Stephanie Danler stole it from me, but I love that she stole it from me, is in relationships you have to guard against relentless hope. Relentless hope. And I think for a lot of reasons, I think it's sort of drama.
She's never said that to me. Yes, that's a good one.
You never said that to me. That's
yeah,
such a good
I'm going to bring that up.
Relentless hope. Anyway, I don't want Stephanie about telling it. But anyway, so I mean, I think Griffin, as the novel shifts in part 2 to what in some ways is, at least for a while, a sunnier tone and a more innocent kind of love, Griffin finds himself in a situation where, he's grinding gears, and is he going to continue to take it, which is a form of masochism, really, which is how he's been educated, I think.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by power dynamics, and this is obviously, this story has so many in them. I think, I'm happy that this is, I'm feeling good about how my questions are leading.
We're killing it.
Because I feel like you're speaking to my next question, which is about sort of the haziness that is cast over the entire book. Griffin often narrates really traumatic experiences in sort of the same ambivalent, I would even go to say, tone as he does like day-to-day occurrences. And there's no clear villain in the book, which I feel you're speaking to right now, this real nuance with these two adult characters who, in other, I think, retellings, they could have been really vilified or and so Griffin's reactions to their behaviors are often indiscernible. It's really hard to know kind of like how they're impacting him. And clearly that was a choice. And I'm just sort of curious, why that choice and what is the messaging behind that?
Well, I don't think that I'm alone here in saying that we all go through that sort of memory hermeneutic, which is that we think back to our childhood when we didn't have language for certain experiences. And you have that moment 2 decades later and you're like, oh my God, like that's what was happening. And so that haziness, and that's a great word for it, and it's intentional, is because Griffin is constantly, the Griffin future narrator who doesn't have a problem with language and doesn't have a problem with articulation, is trying to articulate a kid who is not, in some ways, is deceptively savvy, but does not have a language for his life and does not have a language for his experiences. And this is particularly true for the sexual, domain. Look, I'm going to say something. I feel like sometimes, again, generationally, there has rightly been so much talk about male predation. And we are, in this sort of post-Me Too era, of course there has. But one thing that I also, for every mom of boys out here, it's hard to overstate how much we revered and feared you, ladies, and didn't know what we were doing and didn't have anyone to talk to about it, And Griffin doesn't have that at all. And there's some very, without spoiling things, like some very essential things he doesn't know about vis-a-vis his sexuality. I will also say, and it's heavy, but look, I and many of my cohort at the Trinity School were sexually abused by a wrestling coach. And I'm not at all afraid to talk about it because it was, I teamed up with a watchdog group called Safe Sport to get him banned from the mat for life. He was about to be inducted into the New York State Wrestling Hall of Fame after a 40-year career of being passed around to schools all over the country, okay? So we did not know what was happening to us. We had no language for it. So that what was fascinating was because I'm still friends with a lot of these guys. And so to then slowly start to touch base and be like, oh, that's what was going on. And, if anything, this is where I hope, as a Gen X guy writing from a young man's perspective in 1980, our silence is like, there's a lot of commonality, actually. And that's what I would hope people come away from the book experiencing, is there's just so much commonality in certain kinds of horrific, inflicted silence,
So the haziness was really just to, capture this adolescence that...
To capture what it's like to not know what you are seeing happening to you. Without explicitness. I think there has been, I think trauma porn has run its course. And I hope you don't think of Playworld as a trauma narrative. I don't think of it as a trauma narrative at all.
I think it avoids that.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting choice.
And that's because, recovery of language in Playworld, coming into oneself and beginning to articulate certain things is, it's what we all try to do. We're just, all you have to do is think about falling in love. You fall in love, you're with somebody, and you could be with them for 3 years, you could be for them with 20, and suddenly what happens? You don't have, if you don't get on the same page, you don't have a language for each other. And that is heartbreaking. But in an odd way, it's linguistic,
Interesting. Well, I've just been signaled that we should open this conversation up, which I actually think it's a perfect moment. So we will be accepting questions from the audience now.
Will you call on people?
I will happily do that. I love
you.
being a moderator. It's so fun. Anybody want to start? I think that's quite kind of an interesting point to open it up. Just around, it's a 500-page book that is managing to somehow capture lack of words, which is kind of brilliant and amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
To what degree would you consider this book autofiction?
Oh, I don't consider it autofiction at all. I like to say that Playworld rhymes with my life. I think what autofiction tries to do is, to an extreme degree, blur the line between author and his or her autobiography using the same names. I think you look at the My Struggle books as sort of like the pinnacle of autofiction and all of its subsequent both imitators and people who are in that fray, to something that's more along the lines, to me, a book that over the a series of books that truly rocked my world. And if you haven't read them, I cannot recommend them highly enough, is the Patrick Melrose novels by Edward St. Aubyn. That remarkable quintet of novels, which is really like a gigantic Bildungsroman, which is rooted again in experiences of St. Aubyn's life, but they depart formally in each novel and are so clearly invented. I mean, what I like to say, for instance, vis-a-vis, my father was a much more successful actor than Shel Hurt was. My dad went to Juilliard. My dad, was somebody who pulled off one of the rarest things you can, which is to raise a family as a working actor. I never appeared in an Alan Hornbean picture, but I was in. I did a really shitty TV show for NBC called Hot Hero Sandwich, where I played this character called Captain Hero, and we shot it at 8H, and this is 1978, so I'm with the original Saturday Night Live crew, which no child should be around. It's like, hey, John, it's like, I was like, and again, talk about a language for your life. I was like, what's wrong with him? He's like, hey, Adam, so, but I mean, I was never anywhere near as successful as Griffin is. And so what happens is, it's funny. I was just talking to my brother about this. There's a scene with a horse in the snow in Virginia that I won't give away. My cousins and I once witnessed one of their horses. They had one horse, like get loose on a golf course in the snow. And when I was like 13, it was like one of the most freaking beautiful things I'd ever seen. This horse just, but that's not the way it happens in the novel, and that's because it's a gigantic moment for a certain character. And so I think fiction versus autofiction intentionally bends reality vis-a-vis character logic and story arc. Okay, and is not so reliant on events as they happen. Okay, and that's what I'm trying to do, which is why, I mean, like, yes, I took over the Swanee Review and I was raising 2 kids and I was busy, but it took 10 years for a reason. I mean, you're trying to create a world that is defamiliarized from your own. Yeah.
I was actually gonna, if there's no other questions from the audience.
Don't be shy.
Oh yeah, go for it.
I haven't gotten to the end of the book yet, but
Do you like it? Is it okay? No, I'm kidding. Meet your readers. Sorry.
But one of the things that surprised me and made me have to double check the setting a little bit is Elliot. The idea that this whole family is seeing the same therapist.
Crazy.
And I felt that was actually fairly progressive. Was that something that you felt touched on, like therapy in the 80s, what it meant in the early 80s? Is that more so a characterization point?
No, it's literally before this, I was with my editor, and he was talking about. No, I'm sorry. I was with Jordan Pavlin, who is the head of Knopf, and both her parents were therapists, and she was like, "Oh yeah, like back in the day." Because we're the same age. Back in the day, she's like, there were no boundaries. The Analysans were over for dinner at the parties. You know what I mean? And there was this weird, and my family did have like a sort of similar situation. And there was this weird kind of way in which, like, at parties, this particular therapist had this kind of speaking of hazy, he had this kind of like hazy standoffishness. He'd kind of gently stiff arm you. You'd be like, hey, Jack, what are you gonna? He'd be like, yeah, a drink, please. You know, like he didn't want to talk to you. But yeah, and again, that speaks to Emily's earlier question, which was that I think the lack of boundaries, and also if I could just piggyback on that, you know, again, going to, I see a friend who's a parent now, like nodding at what I was saying earlier. You know, we as parents now have so much contact and interaction with our kids, and we just know them so well generally. I mean, of course, they have private lives, blah, blah, blah. But we're just so much more involved than mine were, right? But back in the day, I sort of think like we didn't have the quantity of contact, but the quality was intense. You know what I mean? Like it was like, you know, the adults would swim up to you like an aquarium's glass and be like, woof, and you know, you'd have this like sort of intense adult moment, and then they'd leave you to yourself. And so, yeah, I mean, it was different. It was different back then. So yeah, I was trying to capture what it was like. Yeah. Yes.
I'm curious, I go to school, I'm like in high school in the city, and I go to school by like St. Mark's, and just like comparing with what you've been saying about your experience growing up with seeing my dad grew up like right around the same time on the Upper West Side, and with was reading over the summer Down the Drain by Julia Fox, and she's talking about like her experience with all of these like really chaotic things in New York City and like just going on these wild experiences.
Yeah.
And I think being a similar age around this time now, how do you think there's sort of been this change in, I think there's still definitely these opportunities for these wild experiences, but at least especially as like a teenage girl in high school, like you still want to, like how it's changed with the potential to like, oh, go have fun, but then also when it gets pulled back from that layer of like fun and exploration to like this, like I can't mess around here because I'll like go get food after school and like now I have some random guy running after me.
I mean, that's, it's such a great question. I mean, like, you know, parenting right now, it's so enormously challenging. Again, I think that we are a correction parenting generation, right? But and yet we're on sort of the knife edge of knowing that freedom and those dangerous experiences forged us. So how do you find that balance, especially where, you know, and my daughters would testify, I'm like, turn on your location. Like the idea of, you know, now we had the sleepover parties where I was sleeping over at his house, he was sleeping over at my house, she was sleeping over, and then someone would knock down that house of cards and like your entire friend group would get canned, you know what I mean? But that required such a rare thing, which was one parent to call another.
Yeah.
Right? You know what I mean? Because it was like, you felt protected. I mean, in your book, your parents have some of that, they have some of that feel. Mm-hmm. So I mean, like, you know, like there was a way in which you were protected by like riding the wave of their indifference, but that's not what it is like now. And so I think actually that explains a lot of anxiety that a lot of kids suffer today, because they don't get to bounce up against the world. And not bouncing up against the world means that you don't get to test your limits. And if you don't get to test your limits, you don't know who you are. And so then suddenly the world seems terrifying. And I'm not a social scientist, but I could then go on and make a kind of like set of theories about why there's such polarization when it comes to certain gray area discussions. Because, you know, polarization and splicing certain kinds of language becomes a way to wage that battle and get a feel for how you feel about something. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, one more?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, go for
One
it.
more?
One or two.
One or two more?
Go for it. We have one right in the
Cool.
front.
Right here.
Hi.
So I haven't read the book yet. I can't wait to read it. But similar to Catcher in the Rye, the way you're just talking about the city, it seems like an ever-evolving character. And given that there is seemingly a lack of a central villain, the city seems to do this sort of like cause and effect. This is the next thing that's going to happen to the character.
Mm-hmm.
because of the environment. How did you write the city and separate it from a setting and actually sort of make it this sort of cause and effect element?
Oh, that's such a great question. So when you write a novel, which I don't advise, when you write a novel, you actually don't have a. I think if you're writing well, seriously, I think if you're writing well, you don't know what you're doing and you don't know where you're going. So like Naomi, you heard from the prologue, loses her finger. I'm here to tell you that I was getting to the end of the book, I was like, how the fuck am she gonna lose her finger? And how the fuck am I gonna disappear her finger? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You know, that it's not like, oh, put it in ice and get to the hospital. You know, like yeah. I had to. So, but what's my point here? One of the things I started to notice was that I kept using marine imagery, aquatic imagery. And I was like, because you have a dialogue with your novel. You're like, oh, like I'm constantly using this sort of, like the West Side Highway is susurrating. You know what I mean? That sea wind sound of the West Side Highway, right? The ear to conch shell sound of the West Side Highway. And so in that way, then you're like, oh, okay, like New York is the ocean. Now there's stratifications of this in Playworld. I mean, Playworld is multiple kinds of worlds, okay? And there's a map in the novel. There's an imaginary map in the novel. So it's the idea of palimpsestically. I'm a huge fan of Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities. Again, if you haven't read it, you know, not a spoiler, but it's about Marco Polo Kublai Khan. And Marco Polo is telling Kublai Khan all about the cities he can't see anymore. And he's telling him stories about all the cities he visits. And they're all about Venice. But anyway, you don't have to read it now. But anyway, so, but the idea is just that like you listen to what your novel's telling you about your setting. And then actually you also then trust that that in a way the literalness of the place will have a symbolic level. I mean, the more concrete and specific you are about a place, the more actually it ends up gathering symbolic / metaphoric force. And you shouldn't be aware of that stuff, you know? So.
It should literally fade into the background.
Exactly. And then when people are like, oh, the way you did this in blah is incredible. And I'm like, yeah, I totally meant to do that.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right, is that everyone, I think? Does anybody else want to sneak one in? Well, thank you all so much for joining us.
Emily, thank you for such incredible questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just very, very quickly, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Congratulations, Adam, again. We have more copies up at the front of Playworld and My Body. Post this book, talk about it. It's incredible. And Adam is going to be personalizing where my coworkers are pointing, this fun little cubby. And please pick up your things. Oh, and I'm going to be taking Adam right there where you can talk to him in the fun little cubby. I know you all want to chat, but we'll be over there. Thank you so much.
Yeah. At some point
like a true actor takes off the mic.
At some point we gotta have that coffee.
Yes, for sure. I'm so sorry that this week was like such a shit.